Alrighty, guys. We are moving on to Chapter 5, Making Decisions. And I'll be honest, I've been a little tardy getting this chapter done because I've been really busy adulting. But I still hope to get it up by Sunday. Sunday, I seem to get her up Sunday, okay? Alright. One of the lessons I learned growing up was that relentlessness is needed to get things done. I learned this by observing my parents. My dad was always pushing for justice for Indigenous peoples, never letting up. My childhood years were spent watching him give speeches, attend meetings, and led rallies, all committed to making change. I remember us traveling around the province with my father, particularly during the summers, always being in and around Indigenous political gatherings, which at the time were very large. I remember wanting to play outside with my friends, but being told to sit in the meetings, to be quiet and listen. Relentlessness has always been a part of the Indigenous reality in this country. The struggles, the trauma, the social realities that include suicide, addiction, and poverty. They are everywhere, but this relentlessness is also channeled into the work of making change. You do not meet many Indigenous leaders who are in it halfway. For sure, some leaders are good and some less so. Some should not be leaders at all. But the vast majority are relentless when it comes to trying to make things better. There really is no other way. That is the ethic. My mom is an example of relentlessness as well in her own way. She protected Corey and me as children from a lot of hard realities raging around us. While there are ideals we strive for in rebuilding our communities, the fact is that as a result of colonialism and dispossessions, life for Indigenous people and on many Indian reserves includes cycles of dysfunction and dependency, drug and alcohol abuse, and sexual assault and domestic violence. In the face of her own experience with some of the darker aspects of life, including violence and poverty, my mom, as a single and hardworking woman, built a cocoon of love around us that allowed Corey and me to see how one endures and withstands whatever struggles life may bring, whether on reserve or off. It's not surprising then that I started to tackle the big issue before me as Mojang. I did so relentlessly. This is how I was raised, and it is the only way I know. It was also a good match for how our government works in this country. With a majority government, there is a short window of 18 to 24 months in which to get big things done. As time goes by, the focus turns more and more to re-election. Partisan games increase, people get tired, and visions of and ambition to do good things wane in the face of the obstacles and hard work that is required. So you'd better come out of the gate in a sprint. I knew this in the back of my mind, but I did not really know how true this pattern was until I began to experience it firsthand. Thankfully, I started strong. I was going to get things done, come hell or high water. I like to jest that my mandate letter was as long as I am tall, and I was ready to tackle it. But priorities had to be set, and two of them were already well established publicly: legislating medical assistance in dying, and the legalization and regulation of cannabis. There were many priority justice issues, the need for human rights legislation that added gender identity and expression as a prohibited ground for discrimination under the Canadian Human Rights Act into the definition of identifiable group in the criminal code, updating laws about sexual assault for the first time in more than 25 years, undertaking the first substantial update to Canada's federal family laws in more than 25 years, working with Indigenous peoples and other ministers to design and launch the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in Canada. Changing course from the previous government on certain litigation matters, such as abandoning the Zerna Ishak appeal, I don't know, in which Canada had relentlessly tried to stop a young teacher from taking her citizenship oath while wearing a hijab, a partial face covering, and undertaking a broad view of how the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is upheld by government, including the litigation and in new legislation. Death and drugs. In some lighter moments, I would joke that it might have helped people if we had legalized drugs first and death second. I also admit I wondered over the years about whether it dawned on anyone that the first major public policy issues Canada's first ever Indigenous Justice Minister would tackle were related to death and drugs, issues that in certain ways have a particular significance to Indigenous people. These were important issues for sure, especially made for me. I was honored to be tasked to deal with them. I could not wait. While they were not necessarily the priorities I would have chosen to start with, they were the ones that had to be tackled, and so was my style. I dove in head first. As Made in Cannabis both involved amendments to the criminal code, I was the lead minister. My name would be on both bills. In all, I was responsible for and saw 13 bills received royal assent as Mojag, and I would in many ways be a public face of the decisions being made. In its landmark Carter versus Canada decision, the Supreme Court had set a time limit for MAID. On February 6, 2015, the court ruled that sections of the criminal code were unconstitutional because they prohibited physicians from assisting in the consensual death of another person. In its unanimous decision, the court held that the criminal laws prohibiting assistance in dying limited the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person under Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As permissive regime with properly designed and administered safeguards that were capable of protecting vulnerable people from abuse and error had to be established. This was Parliament's difficult task, in quotations, of balancing the competing interests of those who would seek access to physician-assisted dying and those who could potentially put at risk who could potentially be at risk by its legalization. This incredibly important case had been brought by Kay Carter, a woman suffering from degenerative spinal stenosis, and Gloria Taylor, a woman suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, among others. In 1993, Sue Rodriguez had raised similar issues, and the court had upheld the criminal code provisions. The change in the court's decisions illustrated how our common law systems work to adapt and change over time, and how our charter operates to protect the essential rights of Canadians. The court suspended the effort of its decision for 1 year to give governments time to respond. Our work was set. By the time I was sworn in, it was nearly November 2015, which essentially gave us only 3 months to complete the work. Upon my request, the court gave us 4 more months. We asked for 6. So we ended up having until June 6, 2016. That gave us about 7 months. This was rocket speed by Ottawa standards, especially for such a major rights issue. Brackets, though, as COVID-19 has shown us, Ottawa can do big things faster and needs to learn to do better and bigger things differently and faster still, in brackets. Cannabis had been a centerpiece of 2015 general election campaign for the Liberals and was a personal priority for the Prime Minister. And frankly, legalization and regulation is good. It is a first step towards the possible decriminalization of other drugs for personal use, a critical step in addressing the rising and tragic opioid public health crisis through harm reduction and treatment service, and one small but important part of the broader criminal justice reform that is needed. This reform included one of my personal priorities, getting rid of mandatory minimum penalties. No, because we see how when you soften up on crime is running rampant, right? Everyone's getting slap on a wrist. Everybody's getting a slap on the wrist. Nobody's facing consequences, and I think that's where we have started to deteriorate in our society. My partner on both MAID and cannabis was the Minister of Health, Dr. Jane Philpott. I had not really known Jane before working on these 2 files. We had met around the cabinet table and at a few functions, including a dinner at our first cabinet retreat in St. Andrews, New Brunswick in January 2016, but we had never really chatted and certainly never worked together. How quickly this changed. Jane is truly an amazing person in all ways, such a model of resilience, strength, intelligence, and service. She has experienced all life has to offer, including the hardest of personal tragedies. She channels all that wisdom and experience into finding ways to serve others with grace and empathy that gets results, and does so with a quiet, fun, introspective, humble, and thoughtful demeanor. It did not take long before I gave her the nickname Mock, or Mother of the Country. For me, she was calm, loving, always providing support and advice, and she did her job that way as well. We became fast friends and remain so to this day. Just checking the time. For all our work, Jane was a godsend. We had so much to do, and we really did fit together to form a high-functioning team. While the work at times seemed insurmountable, it all felt manageable and easier with her alongside. Following our lead, our respective deputies and the teams from Health and Justice worked well together. The ways in which we approach dying and death as both individuals and a society reveal our commitments to and understandings of life, its purpose, and how far we must still travel to be a loving, compassionate, and just society. On MAID, I set out to immediately read everything I could, all the court cases and countless analyses, but also about the work and regimes developed in other countries. Most importantly, I had to know what Canadians were saying, so I wanted to read as much of the mountain of correspondence my department received on MAID as I could. This became an impossible task, so I came to rely on detailed summaries. I was told we received around 15,000 emails and letters in February 2016 alone. We had established a special joint parliamentary committee for MAID, made up of MPs and senators, that was hearing from witnesses. At the time, MPs from all parties were organizing and conducting their own town halls across the country. There was extensive expert and stakeholders engagement, and we also took it upon ourselves to meet as many MPs and senators as we could to have a conversation about our proposals before and after the legislation was introduced. I learnt more about Parliament, the systems, my colleagues, and how I expected governance to work during these 6 months than at any other time as minister. To have this experience through an issue so sensitive and non-partisan, an issue that touches the lives of every single Canadian in some way or another, so early in my parliamentary tenure, was incredibly real and impactful, both personally and professionally, and to have Jane with me, well, that was a bonus. It was such an emotional time. Jane and I bonded even more over the tears we shared with each other and with people we talked to. For me, meeting the family of Kay Carter was particularly emotional, as the meeting with members of the disability rights community whose stories would keep you up at night. Also impactful was meeting with leaders and passionate Canadians such as Dr. Jocelyn Downey, representatives from Dying with Dignity Canada, and the late Joe Avery, to name but a few. Everyone had an opinion on MAID. We were going too far or not going far enough. Almost no one held the opinion we were getting it exactly right, which is often the case on big issues. When I held my own MP town hall and when our legislation received royal assent, I remarked that everyone was unhappy with us to some degree, which must mean we got the balance right. We knew the legislation would need to be amended over time as society's views evolve and we gain more experience as our country living with MAID. Basically, it can be adjusted as we grow into a collective comfort with a regime. I still believe we got the balance right for the time through Parliament, though Parliament amended the legislation in March 2021. They amended it in 2021, which was during COVID, and from what I'm gathering, because I was sick and stuff and dealing with COVID myself, I guess just prior to my sickness, and everyone got away from the news because it was just so depressing and still is, and news really started changing during COVID. So in March 2021, this started to get amended, and what I am starting to realize, stuff got pushed through extra quick during the COVID days, guys. Described in the House and in many other places how we designed the legislation and safeguards at the time. Our intent was to recognize individual choice of medically assisted death for adults who are suffering intolerably and for whom death is reasonably foreseeable, affirm the inherent and equal value of every person's life, avoid encouraging negative perceptions of the quality of life of persons who are elderly, ill, or disabled, protect vulnerable people from being encouraged to die in moments of weakness, reaffirm society's goals with regards to preventing suicide, and encourage a consistent approach to medically assistance in dying across Canada. MAID felt like the first real and critically important presentation to Cabinet that I made, and I was so glad Jane was by my side for it. Michael Wernick, then Clerk of the Privy Council, sat in all of our Cabinet meetings. I remember him saying to me afterwards that he could tell I was a bit tense and seemed uncharacteristically nervous. Well, that was true. It was a big deal for the country, and we treated it as such. After we presented, and although I am, of course, not allowed to talk about the substantive conversation due to cabinet confidences, most everyone around the table had something to say or something to reflect on in terms of personal experience or a perspective on the legislative stance we should take. It was not common that everyone in cabinet felt so personally invested in a decision, and cabinet was great on made, solid, thoughtful, and cautious with a shared view that was clear after the presentation and dialogue. We pretty much had a consensus around the cabinet table throughout. This was so important. It was how I thought it was supposed to work, and it became a standard by which I judge subsequent deliberations. On cannabis, I had no knowledge or experience at all. Jane and I were partners again, along with Ralph Goodall, who was then Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and Bill Blair, one of my two parliamentary secretaries. This was another great team and a good experience. Canada was not nearly as emotionally intense for me. Cannabis was not nearly as emotionally intense for me, but I took it just as seriously. It was also an extraordinary amount of work. I did not, however, want to be the public face of this file. It was not a matter I was personally invested in beyond, of course, the public policy objectives. Indeed, all of us in the lead were similar in this regard. Just prior to a press announcement, Jane, Bill, Ralph, and I had a conversation in the Queen's room, a circular room with a fireplace and huge portrait of who else? The Queen, next door to the cabinet room in center block, about the fact that none of us had ever used cannabis. So funny that we were the ones in charge of this matter. But as noted above, this had been a paramount issue for the Prime Minister. I believe that his initial public commitment to legalizing cannabis, made in July 2013 when he was leader of the party, but not yet PM, was almost certainly improvised on the spot. Sure, there had been resolutions at Liberal conventions, but Justin and Jerry no doubt saw this as a political winner and a way to encourage a broader audience, particularly a younger crowd. Certainly it was effective, and it led to more people supporting the party in the election, and more importantly, actually came out to vote. I had a lot of cannabis shops in my corner during the campaign. As we set about legislating this issue, we formed the task force on cannabis legalization and regulation. The task force produced a report along with recommendations that would assist us in developing a framework for the legalization and the policy rationale behind Bill C-45. They did a good job. The cannabis bill had a companion piece of legislation. Bill C-46 would strengthen existing alcohol and drug-impaired driving laws and create an impaired driving regime that would be almost the strongest and strictest in the world. The ultimate goal of this legislation was to reduce the significant number of deaths and injuries caused by impaired driving, a crime that continues to claim innocent lives and wreak havoc and devastation on Canadian families. I know there are many criminal defense lawyers out there who condemn me for the severity of this legislation. Let them. Frankly, I wanted to lower the blood alcohol concentration, BAC, in the criminal code even further, from 80 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milligrams of blood, commonly referred to as the over 80 offense, to 50 milligrams, but this was going too far for some around me, which I accepted. I personally advocated for this legislation, though it was not specifically called for in my mandate letter. But it was necessary. There is no excuse for driving while impaired by alcohol, cannabis, or any other drug. Impaired driving remains the leading criminal cause of death in Canada. This is unacceptable. Driving is a privilege, and if you drive while under the influence, you should and will be punished if caught and convicted. A bit of my prosecutor background came out around this issue. While the work on these early priorities was interesting, exciting, and effective, it was not without its challenges, some of which foreshadowed challenges that would become more acute in the future and in some ways threaten the government. For example, late in the day on cannabis legalization, a senior PMO official told Jane, Ralph, and me that, in effect, we would have to make a 180-degree policy shift. Imagine an unelected staffer dictating to 3 senior ministers that the decision must be, what the decision must be. None of us believed that this was coming from the PM, and if it was, why hadn't he talked to us? If he was not happy with what we had been putting in place as our government's evolving policy, then why hadn't he said something? We also found it challenging as we knew the Prime Minister wanted the cannabis file to move faster and faster. He said this many times. But when PMO staff intervened in this way, which seemed arbitrary, it caused confusion and slowed things down. We resisted this directive and demanded a meeting alone with the Prime Minister to discuss the matter. The meeting never happened. Jerry and Katie actually chastised us, well, our chiefs of staff, for even asking for the meeting. Are you serious? What? Wow. Really, after about 10 days, a meeting was in fact held, including the PM, the 3 of us, our chiefs of staff, and all the PMO's people. The Prime Minister confirmed we should continue on the path we were already on. Apparently, days of backdoor conversations among all the unelected folks had taken place to help guide the PMO's people back into line. But this sequence of events was, in hindsight, an early expression of a trend in the PMO of insisting more and more that ministers not meet with each other alone. As a result, a creeping question started coming to mind. Who was in charge? Who was leading whom? Whose advice to the Prime Minister really mattered? A similar dynamic had emerged on Maid. During one meeting, Jane and I were in my office in Centre Block on the phone with the PMO. We were being told at basically the 11th hour, after we had been working around the clock, that we had to change our approach and proceed in a way that did not make sense to us for any substantive reason. Jane was crying out of sheer frustration. I started getting angry and uncharacteristically raised my voice and stormed out of the room. We wanted none of what they were saying. We thought it was ill-informed, superficial, political, and mostly a series of ideas disengaged from the very serious and real issues at hand. Honestly, we just wanted these unaccountable folks to go away and let us do our jobs. In the first year or so of governing, such direction from a PMO staffer was more the exception than the norm. I could do my job, present, and have Cabinet consider what I needed it to consider as the minister responsible without too much interference from the PMO. The office was still exerting its control, just in more subtle ways, such as through the Cabinet agenda. Cabinet time was like real estate in Vancouver, a hot commodity. Everyone wanted it and few got it. and the PMO via the Privy Council office controlled the whole thing. You really had to work to get a space on the agenda. There were always too many decisions, policy issues, and legislative pieces that needed urgent attention. There was also the something polling numbers. So much attention was paid and weight given by the PMO to these numbers. The Prime Minister's office made sure that all that matters on which the government was looking weak in the polls were getting time. The issues that were not viewed as politically important could be managed simply by not being given space on the agenda. Getting onto the agenda at all became a game. I'm not sure I was a very good player of this game, of course, because I held responsibility for big priorities like MAID and cannabis legalization. It wasn't a challenge for me to get agenda time on these issues, but there were other critical matters on which the PMO did not share my views, such as MMPs and recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights. On these issues, things could move gladly. They might get cabinet time, just not time that would lead to critical decision points. Things would go around and around. Another dynamic that would become more pronounced as time went on, and that I should have noticed earlier, was the way the PMO could manipulate decision making. There were times that, in spite of the conversation around the cabinet table or even a clear consensus forming around a decision, it would be taken another way. Early on, the Prime Minister would intervene if opinions diverged from his or his office's desired outcome. Later, the setup was more crass. Sometimes certain ministers were lined up prior to decisions being made to present the same arguments for a particular position and defeat what the minister responsible had proposed. The toast was already in the toaster and indeed had been toasted before cabinet even met. It seemed to me like the PMO staff were trying to routinely direct ministers to do this or do that, to indicate that this was the way it was going to be and make sure what was presented to cabinet reflected that direction. One could feel their control and their feeling of being entitled to control building over time. This was wrong, and I resisted the whole way, right until my last day. If there was a major issue within my purview and authority that the PMO wanted me to go another way on, I expected to hear it from the Prime Minister directly, not from a proxy. And of course, there are issues on which even a Prime Minister cannot tell an Attorney General what to do unless they want to break the law. Oh, man, I had to put the book down for a second. Wow. In May 2018, I was flying down to Boston for a few hours to give a talk on Indigenous rights at Harvard. It was one of the few times I ever used the Challenger, and I did so because of the limited window to get there and back, and the inability to travel on commercial airlines. A few of my staff and advisors accompanied me. In a contemplative moment on our return flight, one of them, Rajan Dinesh, asked me whether being in cabinet was different than what I had expected. Rajan was a dear friend and a confidant who had worked with me when I was regional chief. I had brought him in the year before to help support trying to get the Indigenous work on track. He was an outsider to Ottawa politics and the bubble, as I had been when I first arrived. I considered his question carefully and then replied that it was different than what I was used to in Indigenous politics, where consensus building is so central. I had thought there would be more of a search for truth and building of consensus around the best decision at the cabinet table. I had thought our work around that table would include genuinely caring about what each other thought and the diverse perspectives we shared, and that we would build the best decisions by drawing on all the bits of wisdoms we each contributed. I reflected that it was not this way. It was not about forging consensus, and that was different for me and a surprise. A surprise that was at once sad and maddening. So many times after cabinet meeting, ministers would groan about how everything was staged and how their opinions did not matter, or they grumbled about how they did not want to say anything because they knew how the PM or the PMO felt about an issue. Few have said this publicly, few ever will. So we have a system where people at the top, despite having sworn a Privy Council oath to faithfully, honestly, and truly declare their mind and opinion, are not vocalizing what they think the best decision should be in private at the cabinet table or in public to the people who elected them. That's not good enough. I'd say. Bite my tongue. Oh. I will always be so grateful that MAID was the first major initiative I had to make decisions on. It imprinted on me so deeply that was important, why I had decided to run as an MP and why I was excited to be in government. MAID was not an issue I came to government with strong feelings about, but it became a barometer that would guide me throughout my time as minister. How can we alleviate human suffering, How can we alleviate human suffering, be compassionate, ensure the well-being of those that might be on the margins in our society, and do so in a principled way that builds consensus and common understanding? It was the same for Jane, I believe, and I think it was the same for the Prime Minister and our cabinet colleagues. These were the times when people spoke personally about this decision, about their family members, about religious beliefs. Over the years, I have continued to hear how MAID impacted people's lives, from close personal friends and their families, as well as from strangers. I will always remember one woman who came up to me in a liquor store. She was buying champagne to have with a dear friend who was preparing to die using MAID later that day, and she remarked positively that seeing me was a sign. While I had experienced many close family members dying, Jennifer was my baseline reality throughout this time. I first met Jennifer in 2014 over the phone when I was starting to make calls preparing for the nomination contest. She lived in Vancouver, Granville, and was the very first person I called from the Liberal membership list the party had provided, and the first person I spoke to. She was lovely, very engaging, and supportive. From that moment on, we remained in frequent touch, always feeling connected. Eventually, we became more personal in what we shared, and she told me her story. Jennifer had multiple sclerosis, MS, and with that experienced significant ups and downs. She volunteered on our first campaign in 2015. She was there from day one with her kind and generous husband, Daniel, and they were both part of our core team all the way through to election night. I have some amazing photos of both of them from that evening. Over the years, I attended MS awareness and fundraising events with her. She was a born advocate, a crusader. I found her passion intoxicating. In 2016, as MAID was plowing ahead, I hosted my town hall at the Senior Center at Oak Ridge Mall in Van Gran. There were many, many people there, lawyers, advocates, and citizens. No one seemed very happy. No one seemed very happy, and there was a fair amount of upset in anticipation that the government might not set criteria as broad as some wanted. Some held the exact opposite view. Some people were just scared, upset, and or angry that they were even having the conversation. Jennifer was at the town hall. She and I had discussed MAID from time to time before the election and after, but not in much detail. We started to talk a bit more once the special joint committee began meeting. At the town hall, she asked me in her characteristic way the only real question that mattered. Would she qualify? At the time, I did not know the answer, as a decision had not been made on criteria, but I immediately felt overwhelmed with waves of pain, that Jennifer was confronting the reality of potentially ending her life, even though I knew she was in an up period at the time, was devastating. There was a potential, even a likelihood, that she would not qualify under many of the options being considered, which meant that this choice might be denied to her. In those months of legislating MAID, Jennifer was always in the back of my mind. Sometimes she would flood my thoughts when things were being discussed, and I have to suppress my tears. I have a vivid memory of crying in the bathroom in the minister's private lounge at the Ottawa airport when Jennifer came to my mind and heart as I discussed MAID issues with Jane, and as we made some hard decisions over the phone about the proposed regime. Not long after that Van Grand town hall, Jennifer entered a down period. MAID was becoming law. She tried, but at first could not find a doctor who would say she met the reasonable foreseeability of death criteria, meaning it was not medically evident she was on a trajectory towards death. While she did have medical options, none of them appealed to her. She was tired, and who could blame her? She was devastated. Daniel was devastated, and whenever we spoke, it was devastating for all of us. After being turned down a number of times, Jennifer eventually did access MAID. I learned the news while sitting in my departmental office in Ottawa. My heart broke. I could not stop the tears. I loved her and felt such loss that she was gone. I also felt some gratitude that her suffering was over, and I was overwhelmed by the choices and realities life presents. I called in Lee, who knew Jennifer as well, and we both broke down. It was one of those moments when the world starts to feel overwhelming. It was not being mojag, the scale of work and the public responsibility that made me feel this way. It was simply that in learning of the loss of my friend, I was confronted with the question of whether I had caused her more pain. This is a reckoning we all face in life when those close to us pass on, or when we realize we are going to. Have I done good by others? Have I brought more joy than pain? Was I helping, or was I a cause of the suffering of others? Months after Jennifer passed away, I met with Daniel at their house on the east side of Van Grand. We talked about her last days, her pain, how it happened. Daniel said that Jennifer loved me, did not blame me, and was not mad. This was so kind, and it reflects the beauty of Daniel and Jennifer, but one has to come to terms with one's own decisions and choices in life. I still struggle with this, and I expect I always will. An unexpected obstacle that delayed the vote on the MAID legislation was Elbowgate, the May 18, 2016 incident in the House of Commons where the Prime Minister suddenly got up from his seat and, in an effort to get the opposition whipped through a bunch of New Democrats, accidentally elbowed an NDP member of Parliament, and all hell broke loose. It created a reality that delayed our vote on May and meant we were increasingly at risk of missing the Supreme Court of Canada deadline. The incident was also the first time many of us had seen the Prime Minister's temper, so it was challenging all around. Many female ministers were angry, as were so many other MPs, and a bunch of us descended on the office of the House Leader and Whip. Issues were raised angrily about the elbowing and how it was impacting vital work, including the passage of the bill. Finally, Bill C-14 went to a third reading and a free vote on May 31st, 2016. It was passed with 186 voting yea and 137 voting nay. Ultimately, Bill C-14 received royal assent on June 17, 2016. We missed the court-imposed deadline by 11 days. From the perspectives of getting to outcomes on big issues and making decisions made, and the legalization and regulation of cannabis were a success. Of course, people will have differing views about the policy decisions we made and what we did. That is always the case, but in terms of government functioning and process of getting to results, it was pretty effective, and one of the reasons I was proud of the government then. I was energized by doing this work as hard and as much as the work could be. I felt we were changing things for the better. As for the internal dynamics, there were problems, but in this first year or so, when the hard work was done on MAID and cannabis, I thought that if this was as bad as it got, we could find our way through anything. I was even willing to put up with the casual racism and misogyny that I'd known would be present in government, and indeed was present. I so hoped this would not be the case. All too typically, it would often take a white male minister to repeat or vouch for what I had just said, particularly on Indigenous rights and social justice issues, before I felt folks would listen. Of course, there was also the expression of surprise at how I was not what certain people imagined an Indigenous person would be like. I remember vividly the first conversation I had with one of my cabinet colleagues, who explained to me that I was the first Indigenous person she had ever met. It remains a reality that I, like so many women, had to tolerate a certain level of ignorance in order to get the outcomes I wanted to achieve. But of course, in life, the real lessons come from unexpected places. While I certainly had some successes, there was an increasing number of red flags around what was not happening. Vitally important issues, my priorities would be interfered with and delayed more and more on issues in which I had first-hand and lifelong experience. The PMO seemed to insist they knew better. In addressing racism and the legacy of colonialization and in tackling overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized people in the justice system, I was told time and again to slow down. The PMO knew what was right. From my perspective, the message I was getting was approve a pipeline first. Undoubtedly, these delays and lack of will on the part of the PMO to take action on these critical issues was the root of some real tensions that were building. I frustrated them and they frustrated me. I do not think these tensions could have been managed and good results still be reached, but that can only happen when everyone is pursuing a shared goal of advancing decisions. It took me some time to realize this was not the case. While I have no doubt that Cabinet understood that Indigenous recognition, while I have no doubt that Cabinet understood that Indigenous reconciliation and criminal justice reform are serious and challenging issues, over time I learned that they were not taken seriously from political perspective. They do not drive people to the polls, are not often sources of partisan advantage, and frankly are rarely politically expedient. I don't know. Oh, we're almost done, guys. My eyes are getting sore. They are also hard to sell, hard to explain, and hard to understand, so why do them? I was starting to see more clearly our government's answer to this question, which is that we wouldn't do them. Like governments past, we would tinker around the margins, but mostly the plan was to stay with a mix of lofty rhetoric and little action. I did not expect this. My Indigenous schooling and relentlessness would not let me accept this. I wanted to keep making decisions like we had on MAID and cannabis. I wanted this government to keep doing the hard things that made people's lives better. So I pushed and I pushed more. And for some, I obviously pushed too much. Dun, dun, dun. Hey guys, that was chapter 5. What did everyone think of that? I have quite a few notes I took from this chapter. I don't really know how much I want to talk about it because trying to digest it, because there's so much complicated right now with the legalization of drugs and medically assisted dying. Only because it's went from, I think, good intentions to really off-the-wall crazy. Well, I'm going to read everyone Shelley Welly's comment, because Shelley Welly is like probably the biggest fan of the book club. Her comment on one of my YouTube videos, how Narc's Trudeau picked and beat up in jail. Shelley had commented her thoughts about chapter 5 in that video, and this is what Shelley had to say. I had to remind myself that I'm reading JWR's book to get some dirt on the Prime Minister's government, because chapter 5 and 6 I'm finding things I did not agree with her on. Her stances on things almost put it down, but I'm a big girl and apparently a Sansi, in brackets Snoop, so I can wade through some crap because I just gotta know. Shelley, well, you're awesome like that, and I think anybody that is a critical thinker, you know, you're open to, you know, you agree to disagree, right? We've forgotten that. Okay guys, I'm going to try to make this summary of this chapter real quick, because I read it and then I read it back to make sure the audio matched up, because, you know, I'll take a break, whatever. And I think I know what Shelley's talking about. And summary of this chapter is MAID, medically assisted suicide, whatever the proper term is, had good intention, because we all know somebody that in our life that required it. Is with the cost of living, people are wanting to end their life right now because they have nowhere to go. They have no shelter, no food. So it's easier for people to just end their life right now. Or, you know, people that are down on their luck, and that we need treatment. We need treatment for people. But if somebody is like terminally ill and, you know, the end is very near, then I could see it. But the way it's going right now, and what Jody was trying to prevent, was so that people that are vulnerable aren't taken advantage, so they don't make an irrational decision and end their life. They had so much time to figure it out, you know, getting it passed, the legislation, do a 180 the day that they were going to present it, having the PMO's office and unelected officials weigh in on it. Who are these unelected officials? Like, who are these people? Legalization of marijuana. Okay, I am a person that requires it medically. It really helps my Crohn's and colitis. And like Jody said, the biggest part of Trudeau's campaign initially was the legalization of marijuana, because everyone smoked pot, okay? And there is a huge difference between marijuana effects and consuming alcohol. Huge difference. And they had Jody Bill Blair, who is now like your defense minister, who is kind of a little bit shady, guys, because he's given all this money to Ukraine. So I kind of feel like maybe he's a bit of a pushover, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, all these people didn't consume cannabis. So how are they to make laws? And comparing it to alcohol is not the same. We're in there about decriminalization of hard drugs and kind of doing away with minimum like penalties or something. And this is where I kind of found it contradicting itself. Okay, and how we've decriminalized the hard drugs in BC, and they're smoking crack in the hospitals, guys, and they're trying to bring that into Toronto. Doug Ford's trying to stop it, but Olivia Chow, Mayor of Toronto, is thinking about bringing it in. But right now, the NDP Liberal coalition government are making backdoor deals with mayors and going behind the provinces, guys. So what started off as good intentions, I think, and reading this chapter, it got all sorts of messed up, guys. And they said March 2021 they amended the MAID legislation, and like Jody said, on certain things, Ottawa can move real fast, and they did with COVID, right, guys? They did everything with COVID, whatever they wanted to do, and Canada hasn't been the same since. As a result, we have a housing crisis, an immigration problem, because we have asylum seekers, not even Canadian citizens. There's violence running rampant. The cost of living, people on drugs. And the worst thing that we did was decriminalize the hard drugs, okay? Marijuana, okay, it's medicinal, and I've seen other medical issues that have it has been proven marijuana helps, okay? Marijuana shouldn't even be brought up right now, okay? The hard drugs, we should never have decriminalized it, because we talk about how bad it is to be a drunk driver, and we know this, right, guys? But how come we're lenient with a drug addict? Okay, why are we lenient and be like, oh, well, they're just an addict, where this person's a drunk? It doesn't even make sense, okay? Neither one should be drinking and driving, but you're mentally impaired. So how can, it doesn't even make sense, guys, does it? How can you say a drunk person should have, like, the book thrown at them? And I agree that they should. But I also think a drug addict that should be responsible for their decisions when they've committed a crime. You do the crime, you do the time. Somebody in jail, get them sober and treated. Boom. Okay? They don't even have to be in jail long. Okay? Throw them in jail. Anybody, throw them in jail, sober them up in jail. Done like dinner. I can't even talk about it anymore, guys. I'm sure I'm missing some stuff. Let me quickly look over if I've missed anything, because that was so unscripted. I have all these notes, guys, but I feel like I got everything off my chest. Oh, no, I didn't. Oh, no, I didn't. There was a few good quotes. Page 130 about controlling and breaking the law. But what I want to point out is Elbowgate, which delayed made. And that was when Justin Trudeau elbowed somebody. And I believe it might have been a woman. I'm not too sure. Investigate that Elbowgate. Maybe I'll throw up a video on my Facebook. Anyways, stay you, stay true, get to talking, and get to reading, and yeah, we'll be hitting up chapter 6, baby. Stay tuned.